Is Photoshop ruining photography? What do you think? I'm actually really genuinely curious to know, because over the last 12 years of teaching Photoshop, I have run into several occasions where this topic has been brought up. Some of them are by purist photographers who only want to see things that are done straight out of camera, and some are actually brought up by other photographers who are uncomfortable with extensive use of Photoshop in photographs. And I think it's really important to have this discussion. Therefore, I want to leave this discussion open, so please use the comments below and add in your 2 cents to these topics. Now, I've got 5 things that I want to cover in relation to this idea of Photoshop ruining photography, and I'll leave it up to you to determine whether or not these points are valid. Maybe you might be in that camp where you think Photoshop is used extensively, and after hearing some of the things that I say, you might actually find it more acceptable to use in photography. But I might also bring up some points that you completely disagree with, and I really do want to hear about that. The first point I have is the acceptance of a photograph if Photoshop is used. Now, I want to bring this up because many of my subscribers will enter images into photo competitions. They'll also maybe enter them into camera clubs. And once those competitions or camera clubs find out that Photoshop was used extensively, they're immediately discredited and disregarded. And I think that's rather unfair, because there's this idea of Photoshop being a verb. Did you Photoshop that? You'll hear. Or is this image Photoshopped? Well, if you're asking me if I used a high-end digital tool similar to a darkroom to edit my photograph, then yes. If you're asking me if I created a landscape out of nothing in a program that can do that, no, I did not. But what's acceptable? I think what's happened is that we have an antiquated method of measuring what is acceptable in photography these days. Ooh, that's a tough one. I think we're basing a lot of what is acceptable in photography off of antiquated ideologies from the analog film days. And that's really unfair in a digital world now, where all of our images have to be edited in a digital space, specifically if we're using digital cameras. One of the reasons why I bring that up is because one of the fathers of American landscape photography, Ansel Adams, said something really interesting in his book, The Negative. If you've never read this book, this is a book written in 1980, but I can tell you that I actually learned more about digital photography by reading this book than I have many of the books that are out today. Anyway, in Ansel Adams' introduction here, he says something very profound that I think is really interesting for all of us to hear, specifically those individuals who might be against using Photoshop. I eagerly await new concepts and processes. I believe that the electronic image will be the next major advance. Such systems will have their own inherent and inescapable structural characteristics, and the artist and functional practitioner will again strive to comprehend and control them. What he's saying there is that there's going to be some incredible advancements in the digital image, and with those advancements are going to come their own inherent characteristics as far as editing those are concerned. I would think that someone like Ansel Adams, if working today, would be a huge advocate of something like Photoshop, because he did extensive work in the darkroom to get his images to look the way that they do. Yet we don't say, well, did you darkroom that? That just sounds silly. Because anybody who's worked with analog film knows that you can't process a photograph without a darkroom. Therefore, here we are in the digital age. I feel like I can't edit my photographs without Photoshop. There are many different software companies that have emulated what Adobe has done over the course of time to give us alternatives to Photoshop, but does anyone ever say, did you On1 that or Topaz that? No. No, because everything is Photoshopped. Right? Okay, I'm going to step off that one for a second. The second point that I want to make on this is the idea behind 2 different types of photography and how one is more accepted than the other. The first one is composite photography. Now, composite photography is the combination of 2 or more images to create one seemingly cohesive piece. That would be like photographing a background and then putting a subject on it, where the subject was photographed in a studio and the background was photographed maybe at the location that you want that person to be, or it's a stock image that you find and put behind them. Now, that has been deemed as acceptable because it's looked at as an art form, not necessarily as a photograph anymore, but a piece of art. However, a landscape photographer, we are expected to show you what we saw while we were on location. Therefore, if we replace a sky, it is now no longer a photograph. Well, is the composite a photograph? It's two photographs that have been combined together. So what's the problem with the landscape photograph that has a sky put behind it? Nothing, in my personal opinion. However, they're regarded as two completely different things. It's expected that an image of a landscape is supposed to be a photograph, but a composite image is a piece of art. Again, it comes back to what is acceptable, and do we have antiquated methods that we're basing a landscape photograph off of? I would say yes, but again, I'm open for discussion. My third point on this is, who are you creating your images for? Recently, in one of my live events, someone had left a comment saying about one of my photographs that would not be acceptable for Nat Geo. And that's okay. I'm not creating my images for National Geographic. So why would someone even bring that point up? It's very interesting. Now, if I did produce something for National Geographic, if they said, hey, Blake, we want you to go to Patagonia and we want you to photograph that for us. Okay, great. I'll stick to their standards for sure. But if I'm going to Patagonia on my own and I spent $6,000, $7,000 to get there, and all the images that I have horrible blue skies, you better believe that I'm going to put a sky behind them. Because I spent that much money to go there to create my art, and therefore I'm going to do whatever I have to do to create that art. But who am I creating that art for? Now, I would be creating that for other viewers, and I'd be creating that for myself. I'm not creating that for National Geographic. I think it's unfair for somebody to tell somebody else that their photograph isn't acceptable because it's not meeting their standard. Well, if I didn't make it for your standard, you can't base it off of your standard. I have to base it off of mine and what's acceptable to me. And then it becomes what's acceptable to my morals and values that make that image what it is. And my morals and values when it comes to manipulating a photograph might be different than yours. And that's okay. This brings me to my fourth point, and that's the difference between a photographer and a viewer. And again, who are we creating it for? Because photographers are going to be your worst critics. They are. And this is not something new. A subscriber of mine, David McCarthy, recommended a book that I read called Mirrors and Windows by John Sarkowski. And this is about American photography since 1960. This book was written in 1972. Now, there is a photographer who created a series of works in 1959 in a book called The Americans. It was an individual by the name of Robert Franks. Now, Robert Franks created this book, and here's an interesting anecdote from Mirrors and Windows. It is significant that the angriest responses to The Americans came from photographers and photography specialists. Many of them people of considerable sophistication in the field. It was they who recognized how profound a challenge Franks' work was to the standards of photographic style. Again, here we're talking about standards that were in large part shared even by photographers of very different philosophical postures. These standards called for a precise and unambiguous description of surface, volume, and space, and for a clearly resolved graphic structure. It was in these qualities that the seductiveness, the physical beauty of photography lie. Frank's clear disregard for these qualities made his work seem pharisaical, lacking in sensitivity to or affection for the medium. What's interesting is it wasn't the viewers that had such a strong critique of his work. It was other photographers. Now, I don't know about you, but when I go out to photograph the landscape, I don't do it because I want other photographers to see what I saw. I do it because I want people to experience what I experienced. And therefore, I will put my artistic vision into that piece so that you can experience it like I did. Very much like Robert Franks was doing. He was trying to make it feel like you were just an average American in that book. But photography enthusiasts and photography specialists looked at the way he photographed Americans in that time and were overly critical about the way he did it. And it would appear that with this day and age, it's other photographers who are overly critical about the things that we're doing with our images in Photoshop. I gather it's for two reasons. One, that photographer probably knows what you did, and therefore they want to point it out to the world to possibly bring discredit to the image that you have in front of them. Or two, they know what you did and they don't know how to do it, and therefore want to bring attention to it so it discredits that work as well. I can look at Instagram all day long and tell you the hundreds of photographs that I see that have Photoshop work done to them. But would I? No, because I'm accepting it for the art that it is and not necessarily for the photograph that it is. Which brings me to my last point. And with this question of, is Photoshop ruining photography? I also have to ask, are you a photographer or an artist. There are very different standards that are going to be placed on you, whether you claim yourself as an artist or you claim yourself as a photographer. Because artists, since the beginning of time, have been very crafty at making art, and they'll use anything in their power to make art. Because they have something, a vision in their head that they need to portray to somebody for them to see. And therefore, they will use anything in their power to make sure that that vision comes across and comes across as clear as they possibly can with the medium that they're using. Now, a photographer, on the other hand, is just thinking about the camera, the technical aspects of the camera, and photographing what's in front of them. Now, the type of photographer that you are could also sway this concept as well. If you're a journalist photographer working for a newspaper or a news company, I would say that you probably don't want to do a whole lot of manipulation to a photograph. But adding things into a scene that weren't there could be incriminating. So yes, with photojournalism or even crime photography, you probably wouldn't want somebody adding stuff to an image. And I can agree with that 100%. We don't want to have a photoshopped crime scene investigation. But if you're a guy like me, I would consider myself an enthusiastic hobbyist of landscape photography, and even sometimes dabbling in wildlife photography. I think it's 100% acceptable for me to add or remove things to my photograph so that I can create an experience for you, the viewer. But my goal is to make an experience for you. It's not to make a photograph for you. So to answer the question, is Photoshop ruining photography? I don't think it's easy to say yes or no to. Nor do I think it's actually ruining photography. I'm kind of in the same camp as Ansel Adams, and I think that any advancement that we can have in photography that is going to yield better artwork, so be it. Bring it. Let's do it. I'm even embracing things like virtual reality. I'm excited to see what that brings for us as photographers. The idea behind that question, is Photoshop ruining photography, is clearly subjective, and it depends on which camp that you're on. There are people that consider themselves purists, that only see things straight out of camera, and they don't do anything to it in post. Well, then you're leaving a lot of things up to a camera to decide for you, aren't you? Then there's the people who do some wild things to their images, and you might think that I'm one of those. And then there's the in-between. And there's nothing wrong with wherever you are in any of those camps. So long as where you are comfortable with where you are. I'm extremely comfortable with the things that I do in Photoshop, and I'll tell someone straight up if I did manipulate my photograph. I don't have any problems with that. But I don't think that Photoshop is necessarily ruining photography. If anything, it's doing a lot to advance photography because it's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of other companies to make software to compete with it. And therefore, we have seen a ton of innovation in photography in the last 10 years. I think it's very exciting, and I can't wait to see what happens for the future of photography. So what do you think? Leave it in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say on this topic.